Everyone at the family dinner laughed when Claire walked in wearing her old black dress. Her wealthy relatives called her a poor, struggling single mother and told her daughter to stop dreaming about college. But they had no idea that the woman they were humiliating had just discovered a shocking secret 22 years earlier. Her brother had stolen her inheritance. More than $40 million. The mansion, half of the family business, everything her father had left her. And now, after years of poverty, sacrifice, and humiliation, Claire was finally ready to take back everything they had stolen. But when her family discovered the truth, they realized the woman they had treated like nothing was the one person who could take everything away from them. The restaurant was filled with laughter. Crystal glasses clinked. Soft piano music played in the background. At the center of the largest table sat the Whitmore family, one of the wealthiest families in the city. Everyone looked perfect. Everyone except Claire Bennett. She sat at the far end of the table wearing a simple black dress she had bought from a discount store. Her hands were rough from years of work. Her shoes were old. And beside her sat her 16-year-old daughter, Emily. Emily kept looking down at her lap, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was afraid of what her family would say next. Claire had spent 22 years raising Emily alone. She had worked night shifts, cleaned offices, delivered food, worked weekends. There were nights when Claire went hungry so Emily could eat. There were mornings when Claire pretended she wasn't sick because Emily needed a ride to school. She had never complained. Not once. But that night, she had been invited to the Whitmore family dinner. And Claire believed, perhaps foolishly, that after all these years, her family had finally accepted her. She was wrong, very wrong. At the head of the table sat Richard Whitmore, Claire's older brother. Beside him was his wife, Margaret. Their two adult children, Daniel and Sophie, sat nearby. Richard had recently become the president of Whitmore Holdings, the family business. The business had been started by Claire and Richard's father. Their father had built it from nothing. But after his death, Richard had taken control. Claire had received almost nothing. At least, that was what everyone had told her. Claire, Margaret said suddenly, looking at her dress. Claire smiled politely. Yes, Margaret tilted her head. Did you come straight from work? The table became quiet. Claire looked down at her hands. I had a shift earlier. Margaret laughed softly. Of course you did. Sophie covered her mouth, pretending to cough. Daniel smiled. Emily's face turned red. Claire tried to remain calm. Work is important. Of course, Margaret said. Some people have to work their entire lives. Richard looked uncomfortable. Margaret. What? She replied. I'm just saying the truth. Claire slowly lifted her glass of water. She didn't drink it. She simply held it. Then Margaret leaned forward. Actually, Claire, I wanted to ask you something. Sure. Are you still living in that little apartment? Claire nodded. Yes. The one near the highway? Yes. Margaret shook her head. Must be difficult. Claire smiled faintly. We manage. Do you? This time, even Richard looked at his wife. Margaret continued. I heard Emily applied to that private college. Emily immediately froze. Claire looked at her daughter. Emily. The girl lowered her eyes. I didn't want to tell you yet. Margaret laughed. Why not? Everyone already knows. Claire looked confused. Emily, you applied? I just filled out an application. That's wonderful. Claire reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. We'll figure it out. Margaret nearly choked on her wine. Figure it out? Claire looked at her. What? Margaret smiled. Claire, that school costs almost $70,000 a year. The restaurant suddenly felt colder. Claire stared at her daughter. Emily looked terrified. I know, Claire whispered. Margaret leaned back in her chair. With all due respect, I don't think a single mother working hourly jobs should be encouraging dreams she clearly can't afford. Claire felt something break inside her, but she remained silent. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Richard finally spoke. Margaret, that's enough. No, Richard, it isn't. She turned to Claire. You've always been the emotional one. You tell Emily to dream big. You tell her she can become anything. Claire swallowed. She can, Margaret smiled. Can she? Nobody spoke. Margaret picked up her glass. Because sometimes telling poor people they can have everything only makes them more disappointed when reality catches up. Emily stood up suddenly. Mom, I want to go. Claire looked at her. Emily, please. Claire stood. She quietly placed her napkin on the table. Then Richard said something that stopped her. Claire, she turned. Richard looked at her with an expression she couldn't understand. Before you leave, there's something you need to know. Claire waited. Richard hesitated. Then Margaret interrupted. Not tonight. Richard looked at her. Margaret? She gave him a warning look. Claire noticed. Something was wrong, very wrong. But she didn't know yet that the truth her family had hidden for 22 years was about to destroy everything she believed about them. Claire and Emily drove home in silence. Rain hit the windshield. Emily stared out the window. Finally, Claire spoke. I'm sorry. Emily turned. For what? For tonight. You didn't do anything. I should have known better. Emily frowned. Known better than what? Claire sighed. Than expecting your family to treat us like family. Emily looked at her mother. You always say that family is supposed to forgive. Claire smiled sadly. I was wrong. That night, Claire went to bed at nearly midnight, but she couldn't sleep. Margaret's words continued repeating in her head. Poor people. Dreams she clearly couldn't afford. Claire had heard insults before, but what hurt most was Emily's face. Her daughter had been humiliated because of her. The next morning, Claire went to work before sunrise. She cleaned the offices of a large downtown company. One of the offices belonged to Whitmore Holdings. She had worked there for 6 years. Ironically, she had spent years cleaning the company her father had founded. The company her brother controlled. The company that, according to family history, had nothing to do with her. At 7:15 a.m., Claire was cleaning the executive hallway when she saw Richard walking toward his office. He stopped when he saw her. Claire, she turned. Richard, he looked uncomfortable. About last night. Claire continued cleaning. What about it? Margaret shouldn't have said those things. She was telling the truth. Richard looked at her. That doesn't make it right. Claire laughed quietly. Since when does truth matter to this family? Richard's expression changed. Claire immediately regretted saying it, but before she could apologize, he said, You should come see me later. Why? There's something we need to discuss. About Emily? Richard shook his head. About Dad? Claire froze. Her father had been dead for 22 years. What about him? Richard looked toward the hallway. Not here. Then he walked away. Claire watched him disappear into the executive office. For the rest of the day, she couldn't focus. That evening, Richard called her. Come to my office. Claire arrived at 6. The building was almost empty. Richard sat behind his large desk. Claire stood in front of him. What did you want to tell me? Richard opened a drawer. Inside was an old envelope. Claire recognized the handwriting immediately, her father's handwriting. Her heart began beating faster. Where did you get that? Richard stared at the envelope. It was in Dad's safe. Claire reached for it. Richard stopped her. Before you read it, you need to understand something. Claire's voice trembled. What? Richard looked at her. Dad didn't leave you nothing. Claire stared at him. What? He left you half the company. The room went silent. Claire thought she had misunderstood him. Half, Richard nodded. 50%. Claire slowly sat down. Then why? She couldn't finish. Richard looked away. Because I changed the will. Claire stared at him. Her entire body went cold. You what? Richard's eyes filled with shame. I was 28. I had just taken over the company. I was afraid. So you stole my inheritance? Richard said nothing. Claire stood. All these years, he lowered his head. Yes. Claire's voice became almost a whisper. How much? Richard didn't answer. How much, Richard? He finally looked up. More than $40 million. Claire stopped breathing. For 22 years, she had worked cleaning offices. She had borrowed money to pay Emily's school expenses. She had skipped meals. She had lived in a tiny apartment. She had believed she was poor, but she wasn't poor. Her brother had made her poor. Claire stared at the envelope. Why are you telling me now? Richard's face turned pale. Because the company is being sold. Claire understood. If I own half, you can't sell it. Richard looked away. That's right. Claire slowly smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally found the truth. You didn't tell me because you felt guilty. Richard said nothing. You told me because you need me. Claire. She picked up the envelope, then she walked out. Claire didn't open the envelope until she reached home. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table studying. She looked up. Mom? Claire didn't answer. She sat down. Her hands were shaking. Emily immediately noticed. What happened? Claire placed the envelope on the table. Your grandfather left me something. Emily frowned. What? Claire opened it. Inside was a letter. The first line read, My beloved Claire. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Her father had always been her protector. When she was a child, he had called her his little fighter. She began reading. The letter explained everything. Her father had left Claire 50% ownership of Whitmore Holdings. He had also left her the family mansion and a trust fund for her future children. But Richard had hidden the documents. He had convinced Claire that their father believed she was irresponsible. He had told her that she had received nothing because she had chosen a poor life. Claire had believed him for 22 years. At the bottom of the letter was one final sentence. If Richard ever tries to take what belongs to you, do not be afraid to fight him. Claire covered her mouth. Emily reached across the table. Mom, Claire looked at her daughter. Your grandfather left us everything. Emily didn't understand. What do you mean? Claire told her. Emily sat in silence. Then she began crying. All those years, Claire nodded. Yes, you worked 2 jobs. Yes, you couldn't afford my school trip. I know, and he knew. Claire closed her eyes. Yes. Emily stood and walked away. She was crying. Claire followed her. Emily, why did he do that to us? Claire didn't have an answer. Because sometimes the cruelest betrayal comes from the people who know exactly how much you trust them. 3 days later, Claire received a message from Richard. We need to talk, family meeting. Sunday. Claire almost deleted it, but then she smiled. No, she whispered. You need to listen. On Sunday, Claire arrived at the Whitmore mansion. The mansion technically belonged to her. She simply didn't know it yet. Richard, Margaret, Daniel, and Sophie were waiting in the living room. Margaret looked irritated when Claire walked in. Why is she here? Richard looked at her. Because she has a right to be here. Claire sat down. Margaret stared at her. What does that mean? Richard placed documents on the table. Claire now knows about Dad's original will. Margaret went pale. Daniel stood. What original will? Richard looked at his son. The one that gives Claire half the company. Daniel laughed. That's impossible. Claire opened the envelope. Is it? Nobody spoke. Margaret looked at Richard. You told me this was handled. Richard didn't respond. Claire looked around the room. 22 years, she spoke quietly. 22 years, I believed I was the poor sister. Richard lowered his head. I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would sell everything. Claire laughed. You didn't even give me a chance. Margaret suddenly stood. Wait, this is ridiculous. Claire turned to her. Is it? You have no idea how much work Richard put into this company. Claire stared at her. With my father's money. Margaret's face turned red. You abandoned this family. Claire couldn't believe what she was hearing. I was pregnant. You chose to become a single mother. I was 22. You could have stayed. Claire looked at Richard. Did you tell her? Richard said nothing. Margaret continued. You left. You chose a different life. Claire slowly stood. I left because your husband told me Dad had disowned me. Margaret froze. What? Claire turned to Richard. Tell her. Richard remained silent. Claire's voice cracked. You told me Dad said I was a disappointment. Richard closed his eyes. I was angry. You told me he didn't want me at the funeral. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Claire, you told me I was no longer family. Margaret turned toward her husband. Is that true? Richard didn't answer, and his silence was enough. Margaret stepped back. You lied to me too. Richard looked at her. I did what I thought I had to do. Claire stared at him. No, she shook her head. You did what you wanted. Then she placed the documents on the table. I want everything returned. Richard looked terrified. Claire, every share? Claire, the company is already under contract. Then cancel the sale. We can't. Then I'll sue. Margaret laughed bitterly. You think you can walk in here after 22 years and take everything? Claire looked at her. No, she paused. I'm not taking everything. I'm taking back what was already mine. The legal battle began. Richard hired the best lawyers in the city. Claire had one small law firm, but she had something Richard didn't. Proof. The original will, the trust documents, the letter, and years of financial records. The truth slowly came out. Richard had not only hidden Claire's inheritance. He had also forged documents. He had transferred Claire's shares into his own name. He had used the money to build the company, every luxury car, every mansion, every vacation, every expensive dinner. Part of it had been paid for with Claire's stolen inheritance. Claire learned everything, and every truth hurt. One day, her lawyer asked, Are you sure you want to continue? Claire looked at him. Why wouldn't I? Because this will destroy your family. Claire looked out the window. My family destroyed itself 22 years ago. At the same time, Emily received an acceptance letter from the private college. She had been accepted, but she refused to go. I can't afford it. Claire smiled. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Emily shook her head. I don't want their money. Claire looked at her daughter. It's not their money. Emily understood. It was yours. Claire nodded. Your grandfather left it for you. Emily began crying. I just wanted a normal life. Claire pulled her into her arms. I know. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to cry, not because she was weak, but because she had finally realized how much she had lost. 6 months later, the court ruled in Claire's favor. The judge confirmed that Richard had illegally hidden the inheritance. Claire was awarded 50% ownership of Whitmore Holdings, the family mansion, the original trust fund, 22 years of lost profits, additional damages for fraud. The total value was more than $60 million. The news spread quickly. The woman everyone had mocked as a poor single mother was now one of the wealthiest women in the city. But Claire didn't celebrate. She went to the family mansion alone. She stood in the living room, the same room where Margaret had once called her poor, the same room where her family had humiliated her. She walked to the fireplace. On the wall hung a portrait of her father. Claire stared at it. I'm sorry, Dad. She touched the frame. I should have believed you. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Richard. He looked older, smaller. He had lost control of the company. Margaret had left him. Daniel refused to speak to him, and Sophie had moved away. Richard stood several feet away. I never wanted it to go this far. Claire didn't turn around. You had 22 years to stop it. I was afraid. You were always afraid. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I was jealous of you. Claire finally turned. Of me. You were Dad's favorite. Claire stared at him. I was his daughter. So was I. You had the company. You had his love. Claire shook her head. You had everything. Richard looked down. I thought I needed more. Claire walked toward him. And did it make you happy? Richard didn't answer. Claire already knew. No, she stopped in front of him. I used to dream about the day you would apologize. Richard looked up. I'm sorry. Claire felt nothing, not anger, not joy, nothing. Because sometimes, after years of pain, an apology arrives too late to repair anything. Claire took a deep breath. I forgive you. Richard's face changed. Claire continued. But I will never trust you again. He nodded slowly. I understand. No, you don't. Claire looked around the mansion. You think this is about money? She shook her head. It's about every birthday I spent alone. It's about every night I worked until my hands hurt. It's about every time Emily asked why we couldn't afford what other families had. It's about the fact that you watched us struggle while you lived on what belonged to us. Richard started crying. Claire's voice became softer. You didn't just steal money. You stole years, and then she walked away. Claire didn't keep the company exactly as it was. She sold her shares, but before she did, she changed everything. She created a foundation for single mothers. The foundation provided housing assistance, childcare, college scholarships, emergency financial support, job training. Her first scholarship was named after her father. The second was named after Emily. When reporters asked Claire why she had chosen to help struggling mothers, she answered, because I know what it feels like to be told that your dreams are too expensive. She never publicly attacked Richard. She never insulted Margaret. She never gave interviews about their betrayal. She simply moved forward. That was her revenge, not revenge filled with screaming, not revenge filled with destruction, but success, freedom, and the refusal to ever be powerless again. Years later, Emily graduated from college. Claire sat in the front row. When Emily walked across the stage, Claire stood and applauded harder than anyone else. Emily smiled at her. After the ceremony, they hugged. Mom, Emily whispered. Yes. Do you ever wish things had been different? Claire thought about it. Every day. Emily looked surprised. Claire smiled sadly. But I don't wish I had never had you. Emily began crying. Claire hugged her tightly. You were the one thing they could never steal from me. Years later, Claire returned to the old family mansion. She had turned it into a shelter for single mothers. The place that had once been a symbol of wealth now became a place of hope. One evening, Claire sat alone in her father's old study. She opened the original letter again. The paper had become fragile. The ink had faded. But the final words were still clear. If Richard ever tries to take what belongs to you, do not be afraid to fight him. Claire smiled. Then she whispered, I fought, Dad. She looked out the window. Outside, a young mother walked through the front door carrying a baby. A volunteer welcomed her. A warm meal waited inside. A safe room waited upstairs. And for the first time in decades, Claire understood something. Her family had tried to make her feel small, They had humiliated her. They had stolen from her. They had convinced her that she deserved less. But they had failed, because Claire had never been poor. She had only been robbed. And when she finally discovered the truth, she didn't just take back her money. She took back her name, her dignity, her future, and every dream they had told her she was too poor to have. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes the greatest revenge is becoming so strong that their betrayal no longer controls your life. And Claire Bennett? She never again sat at the end of anyone's table, because she finally understood. She had always belonged at the head of her own.